In African diasporic traditions, the underworld journey takes on layered meanings tied to displacement, survival, and ancestral memory. Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon reimagines this descent through the character of Milkman, whose journey south becomes a spiritual excavation of lineage and loss. His metaphorical underworld is populated not by mythic shades, but by the ghosts of slavery, migration, and forgotten kin, as Fletcher points out. The descent here is not heroic in the classical sense. It is communal, painful, and necessary for reclaiming cultural wholeness. As Judith Fletcher notes, the fantasy of a visit to the kingdom of Hades addresses a sense of loss, not just of loved ones, but also of homelands. This archetype resonates powerfully in the context of economic inequality and race, where the descent reflects systemic marginalization. The racial wealth gap and employment discrimination function as modern underworld spaces where value is obscured and visibility is denied. For many communities of color, economic participation requires navigating structures that devalue labor and obscure generational wealth. The mythic descent becomes a metaphor for confronting these buried truths, unearthing the roots of disparity, and reclaiming agency. As Fletcher writes, migrancy can be called the reigning trope of the 20th century, and the underworld becomes a site of reckoning for those living between worlds. In both traditions, the underworld journey is not merely a fall, it is a spiral. The descent is followed by transformation, often through the recovery of memory, purpose, or communal identity. In diasporic literature, this is seen in protagonists who return from their metaphorical underworlds with renewed clarity and resistance. The journey affirms that value is not lost in darkness, it is actually forged there. The myth thus offers a framework for understanding how economic and racial disparities are not just statistical, they are deeply mythic, shaping how communities perceive themselves and their worth. Ultimately, invoking the underworld journey in a study of economic disparities and race invites a deeper pedagogical lens. It reframes inequality not only as a social issue, but as a mythic descent into buried histories and obscured truths. Whether through Orpheus, Odysseus, or diasporic protagonists like Milkman, the descent is a call to confront what has been hidden and to return bearing insight, resistance, and renewal. We are all colors of wheat, each shade vital to the harvest, yet some are still sifted from the spotlight or left for the gleaners. The racial wealth gap refers to the persistent disparity in asset accumulation between racial groups, particularly between white and black Americans. This gap is rooted in historical injustices such as slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies in housing, education, and labor markets. Derinoncourt and colleagues, argue that even under equal conditions after emancipation, convergence in wealth would remain distant due to vastly unequal starting points and compounding advantages for white households over generations. Employment discrimination involves unequal treatment of individuals in hiring, promotion, compensation, or workplace conditions based on race, gender, religion, or other protected characteristics. Emile Durkheim, while not writing directly on modern employment law, emphasized that social solidarity depends on equitable participation in labor structures. Discrimination disrupts this solidarity by institutionalizing exclusion and undermining the moral cohesion of society. Our purpose here is to examine racial disparities in economic opportunities.
my reason for living.
So, Pixar's Soul follows Joe Gardner, a black jazz musician whose sudden death leads him into, the metaphysical realms of the great before and great beyond. His journey really mirrors the diasporic underworld descent, a kind of mythic passage through invisibility, disorientation, and existential questioning. Joe's struggle to reclaim his life and purpose, it reflects the broader historical and structural forces that shape Black identity, labor, and value in America. How does history contribute to the racial wealth gap? Joe's life as a part-time teacher and gigging musician, honestly, evokes the historical exclusion of Black Americans from stable, wealth-building careers. As Darren Encore and others show, the racial wealth gap is rooted in centuries of systemic dispossession, from slavery and Jim Crow to redlining and exclusion from New Deal programs. Joe's marginal economic position, despite his talent and education, really reflects this inherited deficit. His descent into the great before allegorizes the historical erasure of Black labor's value, where souls are assigned spark but not structural opportunity. What policies have been used to address racial economic inequality? While Joe's journey is personal, it is framed by institutional absence. The film, in a way, subtly critiques the lack of systemic scaffolding for Black creatives. As May argues, race-neutral policies have failed to close the wealth gap. Only race-conscious interventions, like targeted housing, education, and employment programs, can address the compounded effects of historical exclusion. Joe's return to life is not granted by policy, but by metaphysical exception, which really underscores the insufficiency of current frameworks to restore dignity and equity. As we pointed out in the previous chapter, the racial wealth gap is not merely a statistical disparity, it's honestly a historical echo chamber. As Darren Encore and colleagues demonstrate, the gap between Black and white wealth in the United States has remained staggeringly persistent since emancipation. White households have benefited from generational capital gains, while Black families were systematically excluded from wealth-building opportunities. This descent into economic marginalization really mirrors the Mythic catabasis, a journey into the underworld of exclusion, where the past is not buried but, hauntingly alive. In diasporic literature, like Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, the underworld isn't just Hades. It's memory, ancestry, and the unspoken trauma of displacement. Judith Fletcher notes that Morrison's protagonist undergoes an Odyssean descent, connecting with ancestral roots through a symbolic underworld that reframes loss as a source of identity and power. Post-civil rights legislation aimed to dismantle overt discrimination, but race-neutral policies often, fail to address the structural roots of inequality. As May argues, only race-conscious policies that explicitly target historical injustices can meaningfully close the wealth gap. The Kerner Commission and the March on Washington called for systemic reforms in housing, employment, and voting rights, yet honestly, many of these demands remain unmet. This policy struggle really parallels the mythic ascent from the underworld. The climb toward justice is steep, and the ghosts of past exclusions still cling to the margins. In Soul, the protagonist's journey through the great before and great beyond allegorizes this tension between institutional invisibility and the reclamation of purpose. Employment discrimination operates as a gatekeeper to economic mobility. Durkheim's theory of social solidarity insists that equitable labor participation is, essential to societal cohesion. Exclusion from employment fractures this solidarity and entrenches inequality. Thomas Sowell further argues that disparities in employment outcomes are not just the result of individual choices, but reflect systemic barriers that reproduce disadvantage. In African diasporic myth, descent is not defeat, it is initiation. The underworld is where identity is forged, not erased. Mavis Staples's rendition of We Shall Not Be Moved channels this ethos, a spiritual Americana anthem that transforms suffering into resolve, echoing the communal resilience found in both gospel and country traditions. Country and Americana music, often associated with rural white narratives, becomes a site of reclamation when infused with diasporic soul. Staples' voice reclaims the genre's mythic terrain, turning the underworld of racial exclusion into a stage for defiant grace. The descent into hardship becomes a ritual of emergence, where value is not assigned by systems, but revealed through story, song, and solidarity. Relation 101. Reframing romantic illusion through mutual inquiry. So, romantic relationships are often navigated under the influence of cultural myths, by all genders, each seeking validation, emotional fulfillment, and permanence in a domain shaped by evolutionary imperatives and social constructs. Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the 19th century, offered a pretty stark critique of romantic idealism, arguing that love is not a spiritual union, but a biological mechanism designed to ensure reproduction. While his framing centers male disillusionment, it actually opens a broader inquiry into how emotional attachment intersects with instinct, perception, and power across gendered experience. Schopenhauer asserted that romantic attraction is governed by unconscious calculations, fertility, genetic compatibility, and survival advantage, not by reason or fairness. He wrote, "Love is of all things the most important, yet it is but a delusion of the will." Modern evolutionary psychology supports this view, suggesting that mate selection is influenced by reproductive fitness and resource access. Yet, this biological framing, while illuminating, risks flattening the emotional and cultural layers that shape relational dynamics for all individuals. The intensity often mistaken for destiny may be a neurochemical response, but it is also a narrative shaped by media, myth, and memory. This framework challenges the notion of emotional reciprocity, not only for men, but for anyone whose relational approach is rooted in service, vulnerability, or idealism. Individuals who offer devotion may find themselves disillusioned when emotional investment is not reciprocated. As Schopenhauer noted, to be loved, one must not be just, but clever. This echoes findings in social psychology, where perceived dominance, social, financial, or emotional, is often more attractive than openness. The nice person archetype, regardless of gender, may be misaligned with instinctual attraction patterns shaped by status signaling and scarcity logic. Importantly, this critique is not a condemnation of women or men, but an observation of biological asymmetry and social conditioning. Schopenhauer argued that women are evolutionarily adapted to prioritize short-term survival and offspring protection, which may manifest as emotional selectivity and strategic behavior. Feminist scholars such as Carol Gilligan have challenged this framing, emphasizing that such traits are socially conditioned as much as biologically inherited, and that relational ethics must be understood through care, context, and voice. The tension between romantic idealism and evolutionary realism is not gendered, it is human. In the modern dating landscape, shaped by social media, algorithmic sorting, and performative identity, these dynamics are amplified. Attention becomes currency, and emotional labor often goes unrewarded. Individuals of all genders who anchor their self-worth to romantic success may experience chronic disempowerment. Schopenhauer's solution was philosophical detachment. The happiness we derive from ourselves is greater than that which we obtain from others. This echoes Stoic principles and contemporary identity studies, which advocate for purpose-driven formation beyond romantic validation. Ultimately, Relation 101 is not a manifesto of resentment, but a call to clarity for all genders. It urges individuals to recognize the negotiated nature of romantic exchange, to cultivate emotional independence, and to build lives of intrinsic value. The path to relational resilience lies not in domination or withdrawal, but in understanding the interplay of biology, culture, and myth, and choosing to engage with others from a place of wholeness, not scarcity. The fusion myth of Southeast Asia, often expressed through tales of fractured kingdoms restored through trust, offers a powerful counterpoint to the emotionally adversarial worldview found in Relation 101. That document's portrayal of gender dynamics as biologically deterministic and strategically oppositional reflects a monocultural lens, one that privileges control, conformity, and emotional isolation. In contrast, Southeast Asian mythic traditions emphasize relational healing through pluralist trust. As Emerson notes, Southeast Asian historical narratives often resist Western binaries, favoring microdynamism and cultural interdependence over rigid hierarchies. This mythic framing allows us to reimagine emotional disillusionment not as a terminal descent, but as a civic opportunity for pluralist belonging. This reframing becomes especially potent when applied to the theme of movement and exclusion. Immigration is not merely a demographic shift, it is a mythic journey, echoing the oceanic diaspora myth of Polynesia, where ancestral migration is both a reclamation of identity and a reconstitution of community. As Chappell explains, Polynesian voyaging traditions were not isolated acts of survival, but expressions of cultural continuity and intentional expansion across vast oceanic networks. When immigrant narratives are reduced to threat or burden, as in xenophobic rhetoric, they mirror the emotional fracture of Relation 101, where difference is feared and strategic dominance replaces mutual recognition. Immigration policy, historically shaped by racialized exclusions, often reinforces these fractures. From the 1790 Naturalization Act to the Chinese Exclusion Act, and contemporary enforcement regimes, race has been central to determining who belongs and who is cast out. These policies reflect a civic architecture built on mistrust, akin to the fractured kingdoms of Southeast Asian myth before reconciliation. Yet when policy is reimagined through mythic descent and return, it can become a vessel for empathy. As Bernstein and others argue, centering race and structural racism in immigration research is essential to dismantling exclusionary frameworks and building inclusive civic futures. Scientific inquiry deepens this narrative. Genetic drift, a mechanism of evolutionary change, reveals how isolated populations, whether by geography or policy, experience shifts in genetic variation over time due to chance rather than selection. In human terms, this underscores the biological consequences of exclusion and the richness that migration brings to genetic diversity, according to Templeton in 2006. When immigration is restricted, so too is the evolutionary potential of a population. As Ramachandran and colleagues demonstrate, global human genetic variation reflects ancient migratory patterns, affirming that movement is not only cultural, but foundational to human adaptability, as shown in their 2005 study. Xenophobia, as Kim and Sundstrom contend, is not merely a fear of the foreign, it is a civic ostracism rooted in the denial of relational complexity. It thrives on emotional simplification, much like the binary gender logic in Relation 101. But when we invoke the oceanic diaspora myth, we reclaim migration as a sacred act of renewal. Michel Keown's analysis of Polynesian literary myth shows how contemporary authors use ancestral voyaging to resist colonial erasure and affirm cultural multiplicity. This mythic lens transforms xenophobia into a site of narrative resistance, where exclusion is met with reclamation. Musically, genres like reggae and Latin folk echo these mythic rhythms. Bob Marley's Exodus is not just a song, it's a diasporic anthem that channels ancestral movement into spiritual and political liberation. These genres carry the emotional weight of displacement and the melodic promise of return. When paired with mythic archetypes, they offer a sonic counter-narrative to emotional fracture, one that invites listeners into a rhythm of trust, reclamation, and civic empathy. Pixar's Elemental from 2023 offers a vivid allegorical lens through which to explore immigration, xenophobia, and racial identity. Set in Element City, a metropolis where fire, water, earth, and air residents coexist uneasily, the film centers on Ember, a fire element whose family immigrated from Fireland and faces systemic exclusion. Though not a literal immigration narrative, Elemental reflects the racialized dynamics of urban migration and cultural assimilation, making it a potent metaphor for real-world immigration policy and its social consequences. The film's depiction of Ember's family being denied housing and facing bureaucratic barriers mirrors the racialized exclusions embedded in United States immigration policy. Historically, laws such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Immigration Act of 1924 were designed to preserve white demographic dominance by restricting non-European migration, as Law and Tichenor have shown. In Elemental, the Fire family's marginalization reflects how policy can shape not only who enters a society, but how they are positioned within it, often relegated to segregated under-resourced zones. In the language and lineage, each guarding its identity like a sacred flame. But when drought struck and the rivers dried, survival demanded something deeper than dominance. Trust became the bridge. Through shared rituals, blended songs, and reciprocal exchange, the kingdoms found unity, not by erasing difference, but by harmonizing it. This myth mirrors the sociological tension between multiculturalism and assimilation. Multiculturalism celebrates the coexistence of diverse cultures within a shared space, allowing each to retain its distinct rhythm, as Kimlicka explained back in 2007. In contrast, assimilation demands conformity, often to a dominant cultural norm, flattening the polyphony into a single melody, as Alba and Nee discussed in 2003. The myth resists this flattening. It offers a third path, acculturation, where cultural traits are exchanged, adapted, and reinterpreted without full absorption or erasure, according to Berry in 1997. Ibe's river pulses with this tension. The Afro-Cuban twins sing in Yoruba and English, invoking ancestral grief and spiritual cleansing. The track is a sonic embodiment of cultural exchange, a fusion of diasporic memory and contemporary voice. It doesn't assimilate, it acculturates. It flows like the mythic river, carrying fragments of fractured kingdoms toward collective renewal. In today's society, the myth reminds us, diversity is not a problem to be solved, but a rhythm to be honored. When we treat racial and ethnic diversity as a source of strength rather than division, we echo the ancient truth. Unity through trust is not the absence of difference, but its orchestration. Raya, and the Last Dragon, released in 2021, offers a vivid, allegorical exploration of racial and ethnic diversity through the lens of the fusion myth, a Southeast Asian archetype that centers on fractured kingdoms and unity through trust. Set in the fictional land of Kumandra, a world divided into 5 culturally distinct regions, the film dramatizes the consequences of division and the transformative power of reconciliation. Each region represents a unique cultural identity, inspired by real Southeast Asian traditions, including those of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Indonesia. The fragmentation of Kumandra reflects the real-world tensions that arise when ethnic and racial groups are pitted against one another, often through historical trauma or political manipulation. The protagonist, Raya, begins her journey with deep mistrust, shaped by betrayal and loss. Her quest to reunite the shards of the dragon gem becomes a metaphor for rebuilding fractured societies. This narrative arc mirrors the fusion myth, where unity is not achieved through conquest but through vulnerability, empathy, and shared purpose. As Hicks notes, the film represents a significant advancement by Disney in terms of feminist and racial representation, though it also grapples with the limitations of Pan-Asian storytelling. Raya's eventual alliance with former enemies, Nama Ari from Fang, Baun from Tail, and others, embodies the possibility of cross-cultural solidarity when individuals choose trust over fear. The film's approach to racial and ethnic diversity is both symbolic and structural. By casting voice actors of Southeast Asian descent and drawing from regional aesthetics, Disney attempts to honor cultural specificity while crafting a universal message. However, critiques of the film's pan-regional strategy highlight the risk of flattening distinct cultures into a generalized Asian identity. This tension reflects broader challenges in media representation, where efforts to celebrate diversity must also avoid appropriation or erasure. Musically, the theme of unity is echoed in the genre of world fusion and Afrobeat, particularly in Ibeyi's River. Though not featured in the film, the track's layered rhythms and bilingual lyrics reflect diasporic identity and spiritual cleansing. The song's refrain, "Let me baptize my soul with the help of your waters," resonates with Sisu's role as a water dragon, whose magic restores life and connection. Like the film, River channels ancestral wisdom and emotional vulnerability to inspire healing across boundaries. Ultimately, Raya and the Last Dragon answers the question of how societies can approach racial and ethnic diversity, not through assimilation or dominance, but through mutual recognition and trust. The film's resolution, where Kumandra is restored through collective action, embodies the mythic promise of fusion that unity is possible, but only when we honor difference and choose to believe in one another.
My whole life, I trained.